Learning was never meant to feel chaotic, rushed, or weak. In ancient Japan, mastery was treated like forging steel, slow heat, relentless shaping, and a moment of awakening where the blade becomes legendary. The philosophy of Shuhari was used inside dojos, apprenticeship paths, and even in art, discipline, and war strategies. It teaches that speed is not unlocked by skipping steps, but by conquering them in order. The mind does not rewire by consuming more. It rewires through immersion, imitation, controlled rebellion, and final detachment into self-rule. The student begins dependent, then becomes adaptive, and finally unstoppable. This is the three-step learning path that doesn't just teach a skill, it rebuilds your brain, your identity, your reflexes. Like a warrior who swings a sword until the sword no longer feels separate from his arm. True learning happens when the basics stop becoming memorized and start becoming instinctive. Only then does innovation accelerate. Only then does mastery move faster than effort. Only then does the learner stop looking for shortcuts and instead becomes the shortcut. For centuries, the art of learning in Japan was never separated from the art of becoming. Dojos were not classrooms, they were crucibles. Apprentices were not students, they were raw potential hammered into shape through a ritual of discipline, imitation, rebellion, and transcendence. In feudal Japan, from the age of the samurai to the disciplined traditions of monks, artisans, and warriors, learning had a sacred rhythm, one that moved slower than impatience desired, yet faster than modern chaos could ever replicate. The method was unnamed by the masses, but lived by legends and refined by time. It was the path of Shuhari, a three-step philosophy that didn't just shape how a person learned a sword stance, brushstroke, or craft discipline, but reshaped how the brain, body, and spirit absorbed the world. In the early age of Japan's martial and cultural formation, warrior clans like the Minamoto and Taira didn't just train soldiers, they raised human instruments. Fighting was physical, but mastery was mental. A young recruit didn't begin with theories of war. He began by standing, watching, breathing the same air as his mentor. Knowledge was inhaled before it was interpreted. The brain was prepared through imitation long before it was pressured to innovate. Samurai warfare later formalized these traditions, turning training into ceremony. The aim was never speed alone. The aim was inevitability. Speed was a side effect of obedience, precision, and repetition. In the famous duels of later warriors, when cognition moved too slow for the battlefield, reflex moved faster than death. That reflex was not talent, it was training. And that training was Shuhari embodied. One of history's greatest learners, Miyamoto Musashi, never rushed his evolution, he trusted it. Before writing his masterpiece, The Book of Five Rings, before defeating 6 years opponents, he spent his foundation years copying form, absorbing basics, refining grip, breath, timing, and balance. His victories looked like brilliance, but their roots were repetition. Every dojo apprentice, whether learning Budo, calligraphy, tea ceremony, or carpentry, walked the same invisible staircase. First imitate, then adapt, finally transcend. Musashi was not special because he learned differently. He was special because he learned fully and evolved intentionally through stages with nothing holding him back. His sword was guided by hand, but his mastery was guided by Shuhari's mind. While the samurai walked the battlefield, elsewhere in Japan's ancient spiritual centers, monks walked the same philosophy through silence. At Mount Koya, the heart of Shingon Buddhism, young monks copied sutras for hours, sometimes years, without questioning meaning. They repeated sacred mantras like Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, not to analyze, but to align the mind with rhythm. Learning was not intellectual, it was devotional. The goal was not understand quickly. The goal was become aligned. For only then would enlightenment or mastery accelerate. Zen monks believed the brain was like water. Only when still enough to reflect could it absorb the sky. Training was inward, repetitive, and ritualistic. This mirrored Shuhari perfectly. The stages existed beyond the sword and beyond temples. They existed in the national psyche of learning long before neuroscience discovered the mechanics behind it. In the ancient world of Japanese artisans, skill was inherited like bloodlines, but mastery was earned like honor. Swordsmiths from Bizen province spent childhood watching their fathers fold steel, heat iron, and sharpen edges in silence. They learned by mirroring, not memorizing. They copied hammer rhythm, not formulas. Folding steel for a katana was not just metallurgy, it was the metaphor of the mind. Fold the metal 16 times, you fold impurities out. Repeat a motion 10,000 times, you fold hesitation out. A sword was only strong after relentless repetition, and so was the brain. Artisans didn't consider readiness as a matter of age, they considered readiness a matter of embodiment. Once the movements became instinct, knowledge no longer felt slow. The brain fired differently. Faster, cleaner, sharper. This was the same learning alchemy Musashi used for warfare, monks used for transcendence, and smiths used for steel. While modern learners sprint toward complexity, The ancients of Japan walked towards simplicity first, because simplicity wires the mind faster than complexity ever could. In Shuhari's first stage, known as Shu, the learner was expected to copy the master's way without hesitation. There was no ego allowed, no commentary needed, no personal flavor introduced. A young student of Kenjutsu stood before his sensei like clay stands before hands. Knowledge wasn't optional, it was absolute. The master wasn't questioned, he was mirrored. This stage restructured the brain to absorb fundamentals without resistance. No distractions, no self-doubt, no improvisation, just imitation. A sword grip was copied exactly, a stance mimicked faithfully, speech repeated verbatim, posture embodied silently. This wasn't weakness, it was neural rewiring. The student immersed himself so deeply that the skill bypassed overthinking and entered muscle, memory, and automatic cognition. The goal in Shu was submission to form, because form creates foundations that brain cannot forget. Then came the stage of the rebellion phase, the creative cracking of the shell. The student earned his right to experiment only after fundamentals were fully imprinted. Like a bird breaking an egg but never rebuking the sky, the learner broke patterns but never the foundation. This was the emotional battlefield of learning. This was the moment structure and innovation clashed like steel meeting flame. Samurai apprentices would now test alternate sword speeds, alter strike angles, attempt chain variations, explore agility, rhythm difference, motion economy. But they never abandoned the basics they embodied. Innovation was layered, not substituted. The brain opened new neural routes, but never shut the primary one. This mental conflict phase, where learning felt intense, confusing, liberating, emotional, was the real rewiring evolution. Her strengthened the mind by teaching it adaptability without chaos. Controlled evolution instead of undisciplined reinvention. The difference between genius and madness lies not in breaking rules, but in which stage you break them. How was the stage where the student learned how to learn beyond imitation and interpersonal adaptation? Finally came the liberation, the stage fewer reached, yet everyone reveried. In the skill was no longer a task. The master was no longer a necessity. The method was no longer memorized. Learning became self-driven and instinctive. This was true mastery. Like a warrior who no longer reads the manual to fight, he becomes the fight. The sword is not external, his arm becomes the sword. The brush is not external, his wrist becomes the calligraphy. The mantra is not external, his breath becomes the meditation. Learning is not heavy anymore, it is fluid, effortless, fast. The brain doesn't resist new skills anymore because it has already transformed into a master learning engine. Rai is when the way becomes invisible because you become visible. This is when speed no longer has to be trained. It emerges naturally. But Shuhari alone never rewired the brain. It was repetition that forged its reflexes. Ancient dojos didn't teach repetition as a learning tool. They taught it as a lifestyle fact. A student swung a wooden bokken day after day, until his shoulders burned, until form dissolved into instinct, until cognition surrendered to reflex. The samurai didn't memorize movements because memorization is slow. He repeated movements until movement memorized him. This changed the structure of the brain. The skill was not stored as information, it was stored as neural certainty. That certainty made additional learning accelerate techs without effort. It was repetition that turned beginners into masters, and it is repetition that every modern learner avoids because it looks slow, but it only looks slow to those who never repeat long enough to become fast. The final secret was ego eradication. In ancient Japan, ego was respected in battle and dismissed in learning. A samurai could carry pride into a duel, but never into a dojo. Because ego creates hesitation, self-comparison, impatience, and resistance slows the brain more than difficulty does. The ancients believed the quietest warrior learned the fastest, not the smartest, not the loudest, the one who allowed the master to shape his mind without arguing for space. When ego left the room, learning stopped encountering internal friction, and freedom from friction created speed. The ancient Japanese model didn't need neuroscience to validate it, it needed time to prove it. And time did. Samurai mastered sword paths faster than armies could calculate. Monks memorized script volumes without thinking about reading. Artisans built dynasties of skill without formal theory. The brain didn't just learn skills differently, it fired differently. Neural wiring became cleaner, faster, fluid, instinctive, ego-less, adaptive, unshakable. And this is why Shuhari remains timeless. Because it wasn't built for swords alone, it was built for minds. It did more than teach discipline, it taught transformation. More than teach learning steps, it reformed the learner himself. More than seek speed, it created inevitability. And where inevitability exists, speed is not a goal anymore, it is a side effect. ChatGPT said in Japan's long and layered history, the second stage of mastery, was where real learning stopped being ceremonial copying and became a forge of transformation. The nation was shaped not only by war, but by systems of apprenticeship, spiritual refinement, strategic discipline, and artistic precision. Learning, improvement, and mastery carried an unshakable rhythm across eras. How was the moment when a person's mind shifted from following form to confronting form with intention? It was emotional turbulence inside a preserved structure, a calculated revolution of thought that rewired the brain not gently, but permanently. Japan's feudal period provides the strongest historical canvas for understanding this stage. Samurai clans didn't simply train swordsmen, they shaped learning culture itself. How was not intellectual curiosity alone? It was conflict, pressure, experimentation, breakdown, reconstruction, and evolution. The student was expected to question the method, stress test the basics, and discover deeper efficiency, but never abandon the foundation he had memorized in Shu. This was the paradox that defined Japanese mastery: loyalty to roots, rebellion in execution. Historically, the dojos of Kenjutsu, focus domains, pushed apprentices aggressively in Ha. The student began experimenting, not randomly, but violently with precision. Sword forms taught by the school were bent like heated steel, not broken. Fundamentals were not replaced, they were weaponized. Students tested stances under fatigue, strike angles under stress, speed under breath collapse, and movements under ego collapse. This stage became historically recognized as the phase where a learner truly met the edge of himself. One can almost see in contrast when comparing apprentice mindsets across domains. In warrior academies dominated by clan honor, innovation was not permission. It was expectation at the right stage. How was a rite of mental destabilization, designed to unlock adaptability and destroy hesitation permanently. The samurai were trained to push technique past memorized choreography and into internal fluidity. The battlefield later became merely the exam. How was the preparation? Samurai training mirrored political and military strategy of the time. The famous clashes between families like Minamoto clan and rival powers like Taira clan were wars rooted in structure yet driven by emotional eruption. Their strategies mirrored Ha itself. Foundation preserved, execution challenged, ego confronted, adaptation forced. Chaos was never unstructured, chaos was purposeful. Outside of warfare academies, Ha expressed itself just as ruthlessly. In the quieter yet equally fierce world of spiritual apprenticeship, monks, scholars, and ascetics practiced adaptive learning under emotional pressure. In sacred centers such as the mountain complex of Mount Koya, young monks who once copied sutra scrolls perfectly in Shu began to challenge doctrine, test spiritual endurance, and reshape the mental process of meditation itself. Their training was silent, but its emotional pressure was deafening inside the mind. The goal was the same: adapt, evolve, compress future learning into neural strength. Japan's craft guilds were no different. Master craftsmen raised students not by volume of knowledge, but by motion accuracy, sensory intuition, engineering elegance, and ego removal. Swordsmithing traditions in the legendary region of Bizen province were built on hammer rhythms copied in childhood, but questioned in Ha. Apprentices explored millisecond timing variances, mental prediction of steel tension, optimization of motion economy, and removal of wasted cognitive effort. Japan's blacksmiths didn't just forge swords. They forged learning systems that rewired neurological behavior through disciplined conflict. Learning in Ha was not smooth. It was not comfortable. It was not motivational for the faint of heart. Ha was where the learner felt frustration, impatience, emotional exhaustion, cognitive collapse of certainty, desire to quit, obsession to improve, collision between structure and curiosity, fire between loyal foundations and rebellious execution. This emotional battlefield was not a side effect of Ha. It was its true mechanism. History shows that Ha is not achieved when the student becomes better than others. It is achieved when the fundamentals survive the student's expansion. Fundamentals were like honored elders. You challenged them only after you became incapable of forgetting them. Innovation was not born from inspiration. It was born from confrontation, painful iteration, obsessive testing, ego death, method bending, controlled chaos, experimentation under fatigue, emotional resistance training, and repetition until thinking time collapsed into reflex. No historical figure proves this better than Japan's most feared duelist, Musashi. Musashi did not create mastery from genius spark, but from intentional confrontation with form after he conquered basic. His middle years were rooted in experimentation, reinventing postures without reinventing foundations. He tested sword timing until timing no longer felt separate from breathing. His victories didn't emerge from more complexity, but from more reduction of hesitation. This was art. By the Tokugawa era, apprenticeship domains had internal names for stages, but the emotional mechanics remained unchanged. In later warrior governance dominated by stable systems like Tokugawa shogunate, training methods still expected a learner to bend method without bending purpose. Even when peace replaced war, there remained unrest inside the mind, not in society. The national psyche historically treated Ha as the core mechanism of cognitive compression. The student burned internally, but remained externally structured. Because structure was the skeleton of Japanese learning, Ha was flesh reborn around the skeleton. Cognitive rewiring happened because doubt and certainty collided inside preserved structure. Japan's apprentices didn't just learn faster after Ha, they learned inevitability. Speed became natural once hesitation was removed permanently. Ha is where the brain rewires not by comfort, but through resistance under preserved form. The mind does not evolve when comfortable. It evolves when destabilized inside structure that cannot collapse. This stage sealed fundamentals into reflexive neurological certainty and eliminated cognitive resistance toward future complexity. That elimination created acceleration that looked legendary long after Ha ended. Ha was historically not the stage where a student learned the skill fastest. It was the stage where the student became capable of learning anything fastest afterward. Shu taught form. Ha taught flexibility around form. Rai revealed the learner himself had become the form. This is why Shuhari rewires the brain, not by skipping steps, but by evolving through them in order violently, emotionally, precisely, inevitably. For centuries, long before algorithms learned to predict behavior and psychology books attempted to decode mastery, Japan had already perfected a silent science of human transformation. This final stage of mastery, known universally among disciplined traditions as Ri, was never about speed at the surface level. It was about the removal of the false self, the destruction of hesitation, and the birth of instinct so complete that learning, execution, and identity merged into one unstoppable force. Ri was not merely a pedagogical phase, it was the moment where a learner ceased being shaped by a system, and instead became the system itself. In Japan's martial history, revealed itself in warriors whose blades seemed guided not by thought, but by destiny. In schools shaped around or influenced by the principles of Kenjutsu. The final transition into Ri was the moment a swordsman no longer recognized basics as separate steps nor innovation as conscious decision-making. Neural processing became direct. Learning became unconscious absorption. The sword became irrelevant as an object, for the swordsman himself had become the weapon. This was not mystical exaggeration. This was cultural inevitability forged by process. Across the retelling of martial mastery, the most famous duelists represented Rai not through flamboyance, but through stillness of cognition under lethal pressure. The legendary duel on Ganrite Island between Masashi and Sasaki Kojiro is often remembered as a moment of genius combat strategy, but beneath the surface it was a moment of pure rediffusion. Masashi did not defeat Kojiro because his strike was technically faster, but because his mind no longer contained the wasted milliseconds of second guessing. His brain did not compute victory. It simply recognized the opening before the opening fully existed. Rai learners do not think faster than others. They waste less thought than others. Sasaki Kojiro himself was a master of innovation in Ha, known for refining long blade techniques such as no-dachi mechanics. But in Rai even innovation dissolves into intuition. Rai does not discriminate between follower or innovator. It consumes both and births something that operates without internal friction. The learner has passed out of conscious choreography and into a realm of flow where movement predates intention. This is why Ri has always produced learners who continued mastering new domains later in life. Language, strategy, art, meditation, measurement, economy, without feeling beginner slowness again. Outside of duels, Japan's military governance proved Ri was not confined to sword arts alone. In the strategic world of the Tokugawa regime, learning principles were measured not by quantity of teachings, but by the internal elimination of reliance on scaffolding. The shogunate were stabilizers of peace, but their internal training systems were laboratories for mastering uncertainty, preserving hierarchy while encouraging inner detachment from validation. Rai thrives when the mind no longer needs applause to continue improving. In spiritual history, Ri carried even deeper meaning. In ancient Buddhist teachings that flourished across mountain monasteries and training temples, Ri was synonymous with ego dissolution. In monastic centers like Koya-san, learning was a pilgrimage of inner annihilation. Young monks began in Shu with flawless copying of teachings. In Ha they questioned rhythm with respect. But in Ri the monk no longer questioned because questioning itself had dissolved. Sutras were copied or memorized differently now, not through deliberate storage but neural imprint. Meditation was no longer timed, for the breather himself had become the timer. History teaches that Lotus Sutra, recited and copied relentlessly by monks throughout imperial Japan, was not memorized for intellectual possession, but absorbed as spiritual DNA. Chanting traditions like zazen or the recitation of Namu Myo Renj Kai were repeated until the brain no longer translated sound as data, but as essential internal state. Enlightenment appeared fast to observers, but only after years of neural restructuring through ordered phases. Practitioners were calmer than mountains, yet their brains fired faster than storms. Even Zen itself, imported into Japan through teachers like Izai, followed Rai internally long before it was formally categorized. Izai did not teach students to analyze tea, meditation, or scripture at the final stage. He taught them to become the act of focus itself. This is becoming rather than performing. In the world of ancient Japanese craftsmanship, Rai revealed itself through hands that worked without wasted mental query. The temple builders of Rai builders constructed one of the oldest wooden structures in history not through manuals, but through apprenticeship DNA passed through Shu and Hai into Rai embodiment. Later architectural philosophy influenced by craftsmen like Sakano no Tamamaro showed that mastery of castle shrine or temple layout depended on drilled fundamentals that survived dismantling and returned reborn as intuition. Woodworking dynasties practicing techniques preserved later by guides such as Daiku no Tek teach us that masters once learned joint measurement, wood tension recognition, and alignment not through repeated recalculation, but through embodying the repetition until recalculation became unnecessary. When measurements live in muscle, learning accelerates without conscious drag. Is cognitive weightlessness. Was also the stage where Japan historically transformed learning into a trans-domain power. Samurai mastered poetry using cadence repetition. Monks mastered painting through brush rhythm repetition. Blacksmiths mastered sensory prediction of steel temperament by hammer repetition. In mastery feels quieter, but becomes faster. Higo no Kami knives, famously carried by craftsmen and duelists alike, were a symbol that the user, not the tool, defines mastery. A knife forged in fire still cuts slow in the hands of ego, but cuts instantaneously in the hands of Rai embodiment. Rai in history always emerged after ego loss, dependency loss, validation loss, and overanalysis loss. It is where the brain ceases dividing energy between learning and performing. The separation between student and skill falls away. Learning becomes reflex. Execution becomes identity. Identity becomes fluid, adaptive, ego silent, unstoppable. This is why Shuhari rewires the brain. Not because it chases speed, but because it creates a learner who no longer slows himself down inside his own mind. Shu builds form, expands the form. Rai reveals that the learner has become the form itself. Quiet, precise, inevitable, fast without rush, sharp without noise, powerful without ego. From the first sparks of disciplined tradition to the echoing halls of wooden learning temples, Japan developed an approach to mastery that fused mental evolution with cultural DNA. If was the final liberation of learning identity, then the continuation beyond it, mastering domains with compression, focus, and inevitability, was the stage where repetition became a national doctrine of cognitive acceleration. This is the phase where legends were not born from talent, nor innovation alone, but from the brutal honoring and conquering of fundamentals until the learner no longer fought the skill, he flowed inside it. And across centuries, the unwritten fourth pillar of this mastery staircase was repetition practiced so completely that future learning no longer required friction. In the Heian era, learning first found structured permanency not only in warfare, but in disciplined domains of poetry, religion, philosophy, and applied apprenticeship. The court scholars refining imperial syllabic rhythm frameworks, whose work later influenced poetic forms such as waka and renga, used repetition as a mental shaping tool long before it became a recognized formula. Young learners recited verses aloud in linear cadence until language entered the body as reflex rather than thought. This was not memorization, it was embodiment. They didn't repeat to store information, they repeated to eliminate the need for storing mid-action at all. In the unfolding narrative of martial education, the samurai schools modeled learning like battle, orderly at roots, violent at edges. Repetition inside Japan did not look like calm perseverance. It looked like devotion, fire, exhaustion, and internal remaking. The legendary duels of Musashi's later years were preceded by decades of repetition long before the duel ever formed as destiny. To observers, Ganrit Island was brilliance. To practitioners, it was the result of 10,000 unseen hours of repetition that emptied the mind of analytical drag. The sword moved faster not because the body moved quicker, but because the brain moved quieter and wasted 0 milliseconds on hesitation. Repetition was not only practiced in sword schools, it was practiced in archery halls, meditation courtyards, ink art training rooms, Buddhist mountains, and guild apprenticeship workshops. The Zen influence that seeded calmness in martial cognition and tea scholars was carried later by systems such as meditation approaches refined through practice dynasties, where still posture was repeated until breath and mind became a singular engine of absorption. Hours turned into years, not for lost time but for gained neural compression. Even Japan's tea discipline painted Han-ri with spiritual brushstrokes of cognitive silence, but repetition sealed it into inevitability. The emotional discipline cultivated later by tea masters whose lineages were preserved through schools like Urasenk Ryokai shows that practice was not about brewing tea. It was about brewing the mind into a focused state incapable of distraction. Every motion was repeated: kneel, pour, breathe, rotate cup, wipe hand angle, silence timing, eye posture, micro-motion economy, emotional calmness under pressure of perfection. Skill was not the objective, identity was. In the Kamakura era, when the Kamakura shogunate stabilized samurai governance, repetition became a military and cognitive culture engine across domains. This era did not merely militarize Japan, it structured the psychology of mastery across society. Training was no longer only for warriors. Training was a cultural expectation for any discipline that desired mastery. Repetition was the unspoken fourth stage beyond Ri, but it fueled the acceleration that followed it. Outside the shogunate's strategic infrastructure, artisans rewired the national identity of learning through repetition immersion. Japan's ancient woodworkers learned temple structure not by reading geometry. They repeated alignment until geometry measured them. Those dynasties later preserved techniques now recognized as traditional joinery, not for surface skill refinement, but for neural reduction of delay. The brain does not become faster by learning more steps. It becomes faster by eliminating unnecessary cognitive steps, and artisans eliminated steps through repetition. The cultural metaphor was katana forging, preserved symbolically across eras by legendary swordsmithing traditions passed down through family schools and later referenced by artifacts such as blades associated with artisans of Siki or Bison regions. Steel is folded 16 times because folding removes impurity. Mind is repeated 10,000 times because repetition removes hesitation. A learner repeated basics not to remain bound to foundations, but to break dependency on foundations for future learning. Basics hardened, innovation individualized, instinct liberated. Repetition sealed the wiring forever after. Japan's history proves that repetition was the psychological engine behind cognitive inevitability. Warriors, scholars, monks, painters, tea disciples, potters, calligraphers, all carried the same learning formula. The brain rewires faster under conflict, but the brain rebuilds permanently under repetition. The difference between repetition in Japan vs. repetition today is emotional intensity. Today's learner repeats drills to remember them. Japan's learner repeated drills to remove the need for remembering them consciously at all. Mastery didn't live in recall, it lived in reflex. The role of repetition as cognitive compression phase is best understood when studying guild training systems such as the craft guild, best preserved through training lineages that later inspired or influenced Japanese hands-on learning practice culture. Repetition deleted friction. Once friction died, learning accelerated 10x afterward. Not because effort grew but because resistance collapsed. The ancients of Japan proved your brain rewires fastest when it is imitating flawlessly. Your brain evolves most aggressively when it is bending the method intentionally under emotional turbulence. Your brain achieves true neural mastery and stops asking for validators or teachers. Your brain learns anything 10x faster afterward when repetition removes hesitation, friction, doubt, performance anxiety, analytical delay, cognitive debate, and self-querying. Repetition as invisible fourth stage. A learner who passes repetition completely becomes frictionless. Foundation becomes DNA, innovation becomes instinct, instinct becomes speed, speed becomes inevitability. No civilization honored repetition more fiercely than Japan. Monks repeated sutras until sound became state instead of data. Calligraphers repeated strokes until the wrist measured the kanji, not the eye. Temple builders repeated wood joints until alignment became neuron, not measurement. Warriors repeated breath timing until the sword fired because the brain fired quiet. Tea masters repeated ceremony until focus deleted hesitation permanently. Repetition was not the fourth stage of learning. It was the stage where learning stops being staged at all. It was the stage where the learner becomes a force who will never learn slowly again. Learning is not fast in Ha. Learning is inevitable in Ri. Learning is 10x faster forever after only when repetition has rewired hesitation out of the mind. Ego questions method. Ha fractures ego intentionally. Ri dissolves ego entirely. Repetition kills everything ego once slowed down. For centuries, Japan did not treat learning as a mechanical pursuit. It treated it as a rite of becoming, a lifelong internal pilgrimage modeled after nature, war discipline, and craft lineage. And beyond the three classical steps of Shuhari, there existed a deeper, heavier reality that allowed Japan's greatest masters to learn anything, master anything, and evolve faster than the passage of time itself. That unspoken stage was the culture of mental hardening through deliberate iteration, preserved not in textbooks, but in the psychology of warriors, monks, craftsmen, and philosophers. If Shu built the skeleton, Ha forged elasticity and rebirthed instinct, then this final unwritten stage, the fifth pillar in the mastery staircase, was the point where the mind no longer learned to execute a skill, but learned to eliminate the inner forces that slow execution permanently. This was the stage where learning became a force rather than a task. Japan's historical evolution gives us countless reflections of this level. Even before the highest periods of samurai dominance, the early Japanese worldview had already celebrated disciplined repetition and progressive breaking of identity barriers. Long before the Heian or Kamakura eras, Japan had begun shaping knowledge through apprenticeship immersion, but once the samurai rose into defined martial culture, the emotional psychology of mastery became sharper and more intentional. The goal was not to learn a technique faster, it was to destroy the friction that slows future learning. The second most important truth is that Japan's greatest masters were not students. They were squires of inevitability. They trained until uncertainty dissolved, not until skill perfected. This is the stage where mind and craft are no longer separate variables. Historian retellings of training lineages in Japan make one fact clear. Fundamentals became ingrained to such an extent that the mind stopped splitting resources between identity confirmation and skill acquisition. Time was not measured in lessons but in neurological reprogramming. One of the greatest examples of this is Japan's monastic stronghold, Koyasan Shingen Mission, where young monks trained under lineage masters copying sutras, mantras, meditation postures, and philosophical laws. Once the student transcended beyond copying, he entered Re, but beyond Re was something deeper. That was the stage where repetition and adaptation merged to create individuals whose minds learned additional complexity without cognitive resistance. In temples influenced by this institution, repetition was not a tool, but a cognitive purging exercise. In Japan's artistic world, no discipline practiced progressive learning beyond foundations more faithfully than the warriors of ink and brush. The famous calligraphy style developed through spiritual Zen diffusion, preserved in lineages later symbolically referenced as part of Japanese aesthetic mastery culture, was deeply rooted in repetition until the brush became an extension of neural reflex rather than conscious curriculum. This discipline later influenced artisans across Japan, not to mimic style, but to capture a neurological state incapable of hesitation. Japan did not only forge warriors, it forged learners. It did not only sharpen swords, it sharpened cognition pathways. From the sword schools of Musashi's youth to the silent meditation halls of Mount Koya, the logic was unchanged. Repetition is the compression of thinking into reflex. Japanese teaching dynasties did not name the fifth stage officially, because naming it would make it curriculum, and curriculum is for students. This stage was for masters. It was lived, not spoken. By the 12th century, military governance such as the administrative framework of Bakufu Mandate Bureau demonstrated that learning systems were not confined to personal training, they scaled into governance discipline. Even their bureaucratic squires were trained through mental repetition of law until execution bypassed hesitation. This is the emotional DNA of how writ beyond. Elsewhere in Japan's artisan culture, sword-forging clans and woodworking dynasties for temples followed the exact same psychological compression mechanics before producing legends. Dynasties practicing mentorship to self-detachment were best preserved through apprenticeship lineage systems, earlier inspired by anonymous masters whose craft identities dissolved into the discipline, rather than standing beside it as individuals. Japan's history teaches clearly, learning doesn't speed up when your actions speed up. Learning speeds up when the part of you that slows action disappears forever. The learner doesn't get stronger at the fifth stage because he does more. He gets stronger because he resists less. Japan's masters applied this stage not only to swords and temples, but to poetry, religion, political strategy, martial law, meditation, ink arts, woodworking, emotional regulation, joint precision crafts, neurological economy of motion, sensory prediction systems for metal, wood, and warfare timing. This was the stage where masters walked into new disciplines without returning to beginner friction, because their mind was now frictionless. One of the strongest proofs lies in the legendary carving left behind on Ganrei Island during the duel era of Japan. Duels weren't fought for reputation, they were fought to escape hesitation. The most famous duel retired masters demonstrated the fifth stage most clearly, not through speed of motion, but absence of wasted thought. If Musashi was the sword, then Kojiro was the form, and the winner was the one whose brain no longer carried cognitive drag. When Musashi carved into world history, he continued learning new domains not through increased study, but decreased internal conflict. His learning speed after Rai expanded across disciplines because his mind had been reprogrammed to absorb without self-judgment. Even the imperial scholars of poetry who later wrote Renga refinements were not just artists, they were rigged beyond learners. They repeated syllables and rhythms long enough that future learning no longer passed through doubt. The spiritual and craft metaphor was elegant and dangerous. A katana is folded 16 times to remove impurity. A mind is folded 10,000 repetitions to remove hesitation. A warrior is folded through shu. His curiosity is folded through hai. His instinct is folded through ri. His resistance is folded forever through repetition. When resistance is gone, learning looks 10x faster forever after. Japan proved what the modern world only studies today. Mastery is not the art of learning faster. Mastery is the art of becoming incapable of learning slowly again. In the chronicles of Japan, the pursuit of mastery was never confined to mere technique. It was a philosophy that entwined discipline, repetition, adaptation, and insight into a single continuum of human evolution. By the time a student had progressed through the stages of Shuhari, Shuha, and Rai and then internalized repetition to purge hesitation, they approached what can be understood as the sixth, often unspoken, stage of mastery, the stage of synthesis and application across domains. This was the era in which the learner's mind, body, and spirit had been forged, tempered, and rewired by centuries of tradition, trial, and transformation. Here the principles of learning became portable tools, applicable not just in one discipline, but in every challenge life presented. In historical Japan, the sixth stage was rarely formalized in texts. Unlike Shu-ha or Ri, which were codified in dojo instruction manuals or monastic practice guides, this stage existed as living practice, observed in the deeds of those who had transcended both teacher and technique. Warriors, monks, artisans, and scholars who reached this stage exhibited a rare combination of intuition, strategic vision, and creative problem-solving. Their mastery was no longer isolated to their original domain. It became a template for learning anything, anywhere, under any condition. The stage was a crucible where knowledge, experience, and instinct merged into cognitive fluidity, allowing the practitioner to anticipate, adapt, and innovate with unprecedented speed. The origins of this stage can be traced to Japan's classical and feudal eras, where the demands of survival, warfare, and governance necessitated the cultivation of adaptive intelligence. Samurai trained not just to fight, but to think under pressure, to read opponents' intentions, and to manipulate outcomes with precision. In early Kamakura and Muromachi periods, young warriors were first drilled in the rigid replication of sword forms and bow techniques. Then, in Ha, they were pushed to bend those forms through experimentation. By Ri, the forms themselves had become instinctive, and repetition had purged hesitation from the mind. But it was in the sixth stage that a truly exceptional samurai could apply these internalized skills to strategy, leadership, and unforeseen challenges. This stage of synthesis is exemplified in the life of Miyamoto Musashi, who, after decades of disciplined practice, did not merely wield the sword with perfection. Musashi applied his mastery to battlefield strategy, personal philosophy, and artistic pursuits. He wrote The Book of Five Rings, a treatise that distilled the universal principles of combat into insights applicable to strategy, conflict resolution, and decision-making. Musashi's ability to transfer lessons learned in swordsmanship to abstract domains reflects the essence of the sixth stage, the capacity to generalize mastery beyond the immediate discipline. Monastic traditions illustrate the same principle. At Mount Koya and other monastic centers, monks who had mastered meditation, chanting, and doctrinal study could then apply these skills to broader spiritual leadership, governance of monastic communities, or the refinement of ritual practices. Their learning was no longer confined to replication or even internalized instinct. It had become a portable framework for excellence across multiple domains. Historical accounts emphasize that these monks often guided secular leaders, acted as strategic advisors, or mediated conflicts, all without formal training in politics. Their effectiveness was rooted in the cognitive architecture forged through Shuhari and repetition. Artisans provide another perspective on this stage. In the Baizen and Seki regions, blacksmiths, swordsmiths, and carpenters honed their craft with meticulous attention to detail. Repetition forged the mind, adaptation honed the creative impulse, instinct made execution effortless. Once these skills were internalized, these masters could apply the principles of material behavior, spatial reasoning, and temporal precision to new tasks. Whether designing a temple, forging a ceremonial sword, or training the next generation of apprentices, the underlying principle was always the same: mastery is transferable when the practitioner understands the universal rules that govern their discipline, rather than merely memorizing localized techniques. In governance and strategy, this stage was equally critical. The Tokugawa shogunate relied on a class of retainers and advisors who had undergone rigorous training not just in martial arts, but in administration, law, and diplomacy. By the time they reached positions of influence, they had internalized the Shuhari path and the discipline of repetition. This allowed them to navigate complex political landscapes, anticipate rivals' actions, and execute decisions with precision. Historical records show that successful retainers were those who could synthesize multiple sources of knowledge, marshal bureaucratic and philosophical, into cohesive strategies, demonstrating the hallmark of the sixth-stage cognitive generalization and adaptive application. Education in Japan also reflected the principles of this stage. Scholars trained in Confucian classics and Buddhist doctrine were not merely memorizing texts. By the time they reached mastery, they could translate moral philosophy into governance, ethical guidance, and practical problem solving. Learning had become a tool of life, rather than a mere acquisition of knowledge. The sixth stage, therefore, was about the integration of discipline, insight, and experience into actionable wisdom, applicable across both familiar and unfamiliar domains. The emotional dimension of this stage is equally significant. Throughout Japanese history, reaching this stage required humility, patience, and resilience. A master could not truly generalize their skill without first confronting the limitations of their ego and the boundaries of their initial training. Her challenge curiosity redissolved ego, repetition purged hesitation. Only after these internal processes could the practitioner achieve a state where learning itself became effortless, fluid, and universally applicable. Historical examples suggest that this stage was often accompanied by a profound calmness under pressure, a cognitive serenity that allowed decisive action without overthinking or hesitation. Military campaigns further illustrate the utility of this stage. Commanders who had internalized the Shuhari progression were able to anticipate enemy movements, allocate resources efficiently, and adapt strategies in real time, even under extreme uncertainty. The cognitive architecture built through decades of disciplined practice allowed these leaders to process multiple variables simultaneously, synthesize information rapidly, and execute plans with precision. This was not mere instinct. It was applied mastery, the hallmark of the sixth stage. Art and ritual in Japanese history also exemplify this stage. Tea masters, for example, after mastering the precise movements of the ceremony, could apply principles of timing, spatial awareness, and attention to detail in broader contexts, from architectural design to teaching. Similarly, painters who had internalized brush techniques could generalize the principles of rhythm, pressure, and balance across different mediums, demonstrating that the sixth stage is not about repetition of a specific skill, but the abstraction and application of learned principles. The sixth stage also reflects an important neurological reality. Modern neuroscience supports what historical Japan intuitively understood: once a skill is internalized through repetition and adapted through Haran-Ri, the brain can transfer learning principles to new contexts more efficiently. Neural pathways forged in one domain become templates for problem solving in others. Japan's historical masters may not have had modern neuroscience terminology, but they understood the principle through observation, trial, and disciplined practice. The ability to synthesize knowledge across domains was therefore both a cultural expectation and a natural consequence of centuries-old learning methodologies. In summary, the sixth stage of mastery in Japanese history represents the culmination of centuries of disciplined pedagogy, experimentation, and internalization. It is the stage where the learner transcends individual techniques, integrates insights from multiple domains, and applies them with speed, precision, and creative intuition. From samurai strategists to monks, artisans, and scholars, historical evidence demonstrates that those who reached this stage could learn anything faster, act decisively under pressure, and innovate across domains. Their mastery was no longer confined to a single discipline. It became a living, portable framework of cognitive excellence, capable of transforming any challenge into an opportunity for application and growth.